Hey guys, Glenn here from Alter Egos. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start this week's episode. This is part 2 of our ongoing series regarding the Rise of Red Skull campaign box. In each of the future parts, we'll be doing a review of a certain aspect of the box. We hope you don't mind that it's kind of compartmentalized into scenario or hero. We did this so that the podcast remains within its shorter time frame and allows us to go a bit more in depth with each individual piece. This week's experimental research is being delayed till Friday. Sorry for the late update, but you will see that on your podcast feeds on Friday for those interested in further deck building. That's all the housekeeping we have for this week. So without further ado, enjoy the Crossbones episode, and we'll see you all next week. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Alter Egos. I'm your host, Glenn, as always, and with me this week is my trusty co-host, Joey. Joey, how's it going this evening?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
Not too bad, not too bad. This is part 2 of our extended series on the Rise of Red Skull campaign box, released back in early September. Have you got any more games with that campaign box since we last spoke?
I have got a few, including one just earlier today. So it's been quite enjoyable still, and just really liking the new scenarios.
Yeah, just whack it onto your BGG or Excel spreadsheet that you've been recording all your games in. But it's been good to just keep plugging away, I guess, with the new content. I'm personally trying not to burn out on it because I know we've got about 6 months of just these scenarios plus Kang. So I'm trying just to hold on while we, kind of have to extend the content a bit further than one might like. But who did you play against earlier today before we get into our topic this week?
Let's see. I was testing a new Spider-Woman deck, and I played against Crossbones, Rhino. Actually, no. I went to the older scenarios after that. So Crossbones, and then earlier in the week, I finished off my Iron Man protection run, campaign run.
Yeah, you actually showcased that deck, the week that I was sick. So I'm glad to hear that it continued to perform well. And you also raised that this week we're actually going to be talking about Crossbones. So I'm glad that you finished off your Iron Man list, and Spider-Woman also got a chance into Crossbones. But why don't we deep dive into the Crossbones scenario?
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, so Crossbones is obviously the first scenario of the Rise of Red Skull campaign box, and it kind of really asks you to focus on engaging with a few different mechanics at once. So one is that there's a few things associated with the weapons that he can procure both from the experimental weapon deck and his own machine gun. It also has some Hydra sub-themes and some pressure from the threat as well. What are your general impressions overall, though, of this first scenario that we received in the campaign box?
I've really liked it. I've actually moved. I used to test mostly against Rhino when I was doing my first run of the deck, just to make sure that it functioned at all. But I've been moving more towards Crossbones for that because it has that similar style of threat. Where he's mostly dealing damage to you, and like there is a scheme that's got kind of a low thresholds on it that you have to worry about, but the main threat is from the damage that he's dealing to you, because you only really lose from the scheme when you flip to Alter Ego. And that's we don't have a lot of scenarios like that, and we definitely don't have anything that's overly difficult like that, really. And Crossbones seems like a progression from the Rhino design, which Rhino obviously was a tutorial scenario, so that kind of makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I guess we should probably just clarify just where our different perspectives might come from on this scenario. So you're primarily a solo player that plays on Expert, is that correct?
Yep. Pretty much. mostly on solo, always on expert.
Yeah. And so I guess my perspective on this scenario is I played a few on standard as 2-player. And then I reckon about 90% of my experience with Crossbones is in multiplayer on expert. So we're probably just going to have a slightly different, perspective on some of the things, but definitely the core experience we probably both shared a lot of, I'm presuming. So why don't we first just touch on his actual villain design? So I'll just touch on standard first, and then we can jump to expert that we both shared. So in standard, he starts off as a 1/1 with 12 health per player. He has the Hydra trait, which is kind of relevant to his overall encounter deck design. But really, his first standard sort of iteration, he's quite straightforward. He kind of lets you set up. You've got the main scheme to worry about. But what gets really interesting is when he flips to stage 2, which is where Joey usually starts his games, and that's because he's a 2/2, 2 scheme, 2 attack. But he has the when revealed ability that gets the Crossbones machine gun out, which is an attachment that provides an additional trigger for dealing damage to heroes, and it really kind of shapes the experience you have with this scenario. And so, Joey, I just wanted to grab just your thoughts on how you felt the initial setup is for this scenario, and kind of what your main focus is as you go into round 1 and 2.
Yep. Setup is quick and easy. There's you grab the machine gun, which I normally just keep on top underneath the main scheme because I'm always playing on expert, so it makes sense. And yeah, you've just got that. You've got one additional setup from the main scheme as well, where you grab a card from the experimental weapon deck. In expert, at least in solo play, I feel like it's basically guaranteed you're going to have a few rounds with the piercing in play because he's got 2 weapons initially. But the overall just setup and initial rounds are kind of dangerous. This way you get a lot of damage in those first few rounds. It's kind of like Claw Freeze decided to turn up at the start of the scenario. Little bit easier because the scheme's not as high, but the overall feels fairly front loaded in a different way because it's damage instead of threat. But it can really hurt sometimes. Like I've had Hawkeye die turn 1 before.
Yeah, that's I'm familiar with that too, where you feel a bit pressured to flip to hero form on round 1 because the first main scheme is a threshold of 3 per player. And so in solo, definitely you feel almost obliged to flip to try and maintain a bit of control on that first main scheme. But it really does expose you to sort of a high-risk situation where he might have 3 attack because one of the weapons from the experimental weapon deck might have come out that gives him +1. And then he has a machine gun trigger, which discards the top card of the encounter deck and deals indirect damage to you based on the number of pips. And and then he's attacking you afterwards. So I've definitely had 9 damage dealt to me just before we draw our first encounter card. So I definitely feel you on the death of turn 1. I guess I should just probably add in 2-player, what's more interesting to me is that because there's 2 of you, if you both flip, you have the same tempo or impact of the machine gun being used up, but you also expose yourself to a higher risk of Crossbones activating a second time because 2 of you are drawing cards, and he has, I believe, the assaults that can trigger the extra activation. And the gang up. So there's 3 cards out of the 40 aside from the Weapon Master module. So he's got 5 out of 40 cards. So it's like a 1 in 8 chance to draw. And that can be really risky because if he activates a second time, that obviously means the machine gun's going to go off twice, which can spell doom if you don't have a chump blocker in play. Do you have anything further to add to that initial experience?
Yep. The main difference with that is that it's only really a big threat if you're running the Weapon Master set, because his deck is so huge once you get all 3 of your your modular sets in. It's I think in most cases you're pushing about 40 cards. It's even if you're getting 4 cards, you would need like 10 copies of the villain attacks you to expect to have one dealt to a player, and it's not a possibility currently. There's not enough of those in modular sets to actually push that far enough to be a common occurrence.
Yeah, it kind of just adds a little bit of flavor to a scenario where, a untimely full auto or one of the weapon master treacheries kind of ends your career a bit early. But it kind of also allows for some deck building opportunities where you kind of do want to find an ally turn 1 that you can put some of that indirect damage on, or you want some way to further optimize your defensive potential. Because I've had games where I've exhausted to defend, and then the card afterwards is the weapon master or an assault, and you just have nothing in play on turn 1 to really mitigate any of that additional damage, and that can prove deadly.
Yep, and you definitely don't want to be leaning into tough as your defensive mechanism.
Yeah,
that is the worst idea.
Yeah, you mentioned that before, and it's probably just important to note that this scenario kind of uniquely kind of forces you to consider going a different route, especially early on. And so the most common way people have played previously is probably with the Rings of Ragabond from Doctor Strange.
Ragador, but yep.
Ragador, sorry. Yeah, so clearly I don't play him that often. But you used to be able to generate tough and you could sit back and feel a bit relaxed. Do you think piercing takes him down a peg at all in this scenario, or do you think because of the stun and confuse element, he still has a pretty good shot into Crossbones?
There's also a lack of minions in the scenario, so I would think that Doctor Strange would be fine. But if I was to play Doctor Strange into him at the moment, I would probably go back and play a deck where I'm using a lot of allies so that I can use the tough to turn them into additional activations rather than trying to put it on myself.
Yeah, he also has, because he doesn't have many minions, there's not much guard or things that are kind of preventing damage into him. So the scenario can go a bit shorter than what you generally expect. I think the only card in his signature set is his villain set is the Hard as Nails card that gives him a tough. And then there's the Hydra soldiers, I guess, from Legions of Hydra that kind of give him potential ways to slow down the heroes. But ultimately, it gives you that feeling of the chase that kind of really comes through a lot. And I just wanted to quickly grab your thoughts on how you found the main scheme threat thresholds as well.
In solo, they're brutal. Overall, it's, 11 per player by the end? No, 14 per player by the end. But because it's split up into 3, 6, and 5, basically anytime you flip to Alter Ego, you lose a scheme. It's not quite on the 6. You can sometimes get by because you put 1 on there and then he schemes for a minimum of 2, which means that he needs a free pip to guarantee it going forward. But that's assuming you had it empty to start with. The other 2, though, they're gone. And considering it ends on the 5, not on the 6, it can be a really, really dangerous to go to Alter Ego in this scenario without a confuse.
Yeah, I found in multiplayer the 6 per player was kind of like a nice breath of fresh air. So often the first game would flip during my game, but you could kind of stabilize a little bit on the second main scheme. But in solo play, I definitely share. Again, I feel like it lends to that sort of chase element where you kind of at a certain point need to make a decision to really close out the game rather rapidly, because if it gets to the final main scheme, there's always a chance that the encounter deck reveals a advance, and then you're very likely going to unfortunately lose from that point. So some of these villain cards that I thought we might just quickly mention. Did you have any deep impressions of his Crossbones armor, for instance? What did you think about combining the Rhino card with a +1/+1?
Yeah, that's a pretty big boost to that card. You still generally try and clear it as soon as it goes down, and I feel like Rhino has more guard and more toughness, and it has that annoying stun when you flip him. So it's a little bit harder to clear it from Rhino, but I still want to clear that as soon as possible. And 5 is an awkward number a lot of the time to actually deal damage to clear.
It's sort of like Haymaker and a base attack of 2 is a good friend, but obviously there's probably most heroes have other ways to deal it. But I thought that was interesting that 5 has always felt like there's that natural number for some of the core set cards, but it's not as optimal obviously compared to some of the other pickings that heroes have now.
Yeah, it always feels like a weird number to actually try and hit. Um, like if you like you can't clear it with a relentless assault, for instance, because you would hit the minion for at least one. If it was 4 or less, you could actually use that, and you're pretty much guaranteed to have to use a like Yarnborn trigger or something extra.
Yeah, these sort of cards seem to require two effects. Like a player has to commit 2 effects to clear it, which I kind of like. I think that's kind of a good design. We saw the reintroduction of the Hydra bombers here as well. How did you feel they were placed in this scenario?
They feel like nothing. They still feel like nothing. I think to me they feel like that's supposed to be like this is a break. You've got your card. It's basically nothing. Take your break now. You can not be completely destroyed by this opening scenario of the campaign. Like they're not scary in they're in the that first one, Bomb Scare, right? They're in the Bomb Scare modular set, aren't they?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, they're not scary in that, and they're not scary here.
I mean, it is just Hydra Bob showing up, so there is a bit of a theme behind it as well, even though it's probably unintentional because it's meant to just be a Hydra goon.
Yeah, these are the things I go looking for when I flip a Hail Hydra.
Yeah, I guess we're going to talk about the modular sets in a later episode, but I guess we should probably just quickly discuss that. The modular sets included the Hydra Assault and Legions of Hydra, and then the Weapon Master. We kind of touched on how Weapon Master has a few additional weapons, and the Treachery, which surges if you have a weapon attached. But I guess we should just quickly cover the other two. So Hydra Assault has the Hail Hydra, which allows players to go search for a Hydra minion if they don't have one engaged with them while in hero form, because that would trigger an attack instead. But what are your impressions of the Hydra Assault modular in this particular scenario?
Hydra Assault in this one, it just adds a lot of minions. It's what's actually putting his minion count up to reasonable numbers, because he only has the 2 Hydra bombers in his actual base set. So it makes sense if you want to run Thor into this, you probably want to have something like that. Although it's not guaranteed, you don't have to run that modular set. You don't have to run any of those modular sets, in fact. But I find the Hydra Assault pretty interesting because it like the quick strike on the aerial in this one, because this is a damage threat. Like I think the biggest threat in this scenario is the damage. Just having something that has quick strike that can just come out mysteriously, and then quick strike when you're maybe exhausted already because you defended because you needed to survive. That's an interesting thing to include. The flame guys, I'm not as big on. A lot of the time, I look at the board and I'm like, I don't actually have a support, but the fact that they can trigger as a boost can be a big deal when that happens.
Yeah, I quite like the Hydra Flame Soldier as to what it's threatening. The most interesting thing I find about this modular set in Crossbones is that they're actually not good for the machine gun trigger. So they kind of give you that breathing space or opportunity where the machine gun is, quote unquote jammed rather than dishing out 2 to 3 damage. I also like that the Hydra Jet Trooper kind of reflects its quick strike nature in the boost ability as well, where if you're in hero form, the villain will attack you, even if they don't have he doesn't get a boost card dealt, but the machine gun, again, can still trigger off that secondary attack.
I got hit for 5 with that the other day. That was odd.
Yeah, I think like you said, like damage is the main sort of risk in this scenario. But the interesting thing is, if you get pressured to flip back to alter ego, then the main scheme advances in a way that feels very carefully curated. So I quite like that tension that's there between the two.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that the threat numbers are where they are purely so that you have 2 turns in alter ego pretty much before you lose. At least in solo multiplayer, you can afford to take some turns in. Like some of the people can afford to take turns in alter ego.
Only if you have allies out, because it's like you don't like if one person's copying all the machine gun triggers, you really do need, like I said, you kind of really do need allies either to chump block or to soak some of the indirect. And because he doesn't have overkill, it kind of does reduce that degree of tension that exists. But that's the only thing holding it back, because if he had a way to generate overkill, there's a very real risk that many heroes would die in this first scenario before they can progress further in the story. So I think for a first scenario, I'm kind of glad that there's not the overkill.
Just throw in some Ronin and you'll be getting murdered all the time.
That even I think I don't know if it's the weapon, the accuse, but like that attaches to you as a player. So interestingly, that wouldn't go on the villain. And now I'm curious. I want to see if Raid the Armory, which is one of your favorite cards, I wonder if that would put the accused onto the villain. Does that actually work?
No.
It
the
just reveals the
accused is
card.
not a weapon.
Oh, it's not a weapon. Okay.
It's a condition.
It's a condition. Well, I mean, that makes sense, but it is a picture of a hammer, so I thought maybe it was a weapon. But
there's very few weapons available overall. There's the Goblin Gimmicks has the pumpkin bombs, the Weapon Master has the pistol and the knife, and I believe you mentioned to me earlier there's one in Under Assault, though I don't know which one it is off the top of my head.
So Under Attack has the concussion blasters, which is a weapon, and it gives Retaliate 1. It's pretty nasty. But yeah, there's not as many weapons around. And you talked about how Raid the Armory is kind of like an acceleration token for you if you switch out the modular set. But in standard play, it does work as intended. So there is some thought behind the card, I think.
Yeah, because there's only one weapon in the whole set. Raid the Armory in expert play just so often just gives you a acceleration token, and like Insight 1 gain an acceleration token and shuffle the discarded deck together is really brutal, particularly on like turn 1 or turn 2, and particularly if it's turn 1 and turn 2. But yeah, I'm sure you can manage it still. It's just I would have liked to have another weapon in here, even just one in the deck, so I'm not getting an acceleration token because I flipped Raid the Armory turn 1.
I mean, if you wanted to play against that, you could discard the experimental weapon that's in play, and then you wouldn't have that issue. Do you like, what's your general strategy for those? Does it depend what it is as to how high priority it is as a removal, or do you leave it in play throughout the scenario? What's your approach to the experimental weapons?
Depends what it is, depends what my hand is. Generally speaking, I don't remove them turn 1 because turn 1 I have no board at the moment, and spending a third of my hand or more to clear the experimental weapon is those are resources that I can't turn into more advantage later. I'd rather play an expensive ally or set up something that is going to like an upgrade or support that will help me long term, or even just stop him from attacking turn 1 so I can have a little bit of breathing room. So I often don't remove them turn 1, but it does kind of depend what it is. If I'm playing leadership, I'll probably try to remove the Retaliate 1 turn 1. I generally don't even bother removing the laser rifle or the exosuit because it's just plus stats, and generally speaking, if I'm taking hits direct from the villain, I'm okay with taking like 1 or 2 hits direct from the villain, where it's only just at like +1 attack. It's I'm gonna try and work out ways to block them with allies, do some stuns, etc. long term to keep my hit points up. So it doesn't matter that those 1 or 2 hits gets through, unless you're playing unflappable. If you're doing an unflappable build, you really need to keep those attacks to numbers you can manage. Although that changes based off the deck as well. Your deck might be able to defend for 7 consistently.
Yeah, that'd be expert defense. Yeah, here we go. But yeah, I think you raised some good points there, and it kind of segues nicely into the full auto card, because I do like that there is a card in his encounter set that kind of punishes you for keeping the stats around. I've had many memorable games now where I've discarded 4, occasionally 5 cards from the deck and paid dearly for it. But I think it's a really positive card to have in his set. It's sort of like an alternative win condition for him almost if you don't engage with the weapons that are coming out from the experimental weapon deck. But I wasn't sure how you'd found it in solo play, because in multiplayer you kind of have more chances to defend and then get some allies into play to soak it. But I wasn't sure how it goes in solo play.
Yeah, it's normally direct damage to your hero. It can be very rough. Like generally speaking, boost icons aren't actually that high in any given setup. I would say you probably hit about 1 to somewhere between the 1 to 2 mark is the average. So even if he has like 5 attack, you're probably expecting somewhere around 7-8 damage, which is a lot, but it's not necessarily a game loss. Although in my most recent game, I did keep a Spycraft around specifically for full auto because he was sitting on 5 attack and I knew it would kill me. But it's also not an attack from him, which is important because you can actually use tough in this case.
How does tough work? Like, let's say you have 3 health left and it deals 5 damage. How does tough work in that situation?
Tough will clear all of it in that situation. The situation you're thinking of is if tough is on an ally, you can't assign more of it to them than you would than they have hit points. So you can't give Luke Cage with tough more than 5 of the indirect, because he would have died by that point and it needs to go on your hero. But your hero is considered to be able to go to any amount because it would die, right?
Okay, that's cool. It's good to know. And I guess the other thing I thought about was how his activation cards that he has. So most villains we've seen often have a card in their villain set that can cause an activation. And I found it interesting that Crossbones has them as side schemes with acceleration tokens. And I'd wondered how you found that in solo, because in multiplayer, we actually left these cards out because it was a place for master plan to dump threat rather than search for another one. But I wasn't sure, again, if in solo the acceleration token was a bit too impactful to leave on the board.
You got to get rid of them in solo. It's too much. It means that you're like an acceleration token on that first game means you have to clear the threat every turn, all of the threat every turn. On the second scheme, it means that if you flip to alter ego, you've only got the 2 leeway, even if you had it completely clear. It's not ideal. Those numbers on the side schemes are not on the side schemes, on the main schemes are too low to allow an acceleration to sit on the table for too long. I actually did have one problem with this. When I was playing Iron Man, I was airborne. I was aerial, and I used my helmet to clear 1 threat, and from the main scheme, and it also cleared the last threat on the Crossbones Assault, and then he attacked me and killed me off turn. Because I completely forgot to take it into account that was going to clear from the Crossbones Assault. I should have used the helmet before I went airborne, because I could handle the extra 1 threat for 1 turn.
Yeah, the classic sequencing error. Makes sense.
Yeah. I don't really want to be taking 2 attacks, particularly if I'm on 9 or less hit points. and it's effectively taking 2 attacks. Although the next game I was able to, I had the same thing come up, except this time I had Expert Defense in hand that I hadn't managed to use the turn before. Defended, used Expert Defense, and triggered Unflappable in the hero phase, which was fun.
Yeah, it sort of kind of raises the stock a little bit of protection, and I think it's just an interesting way to introduce activations from a villain. The other side communities set that I thought was interesting, and I don't see much discussion about it, is how did you find Cornered Staff in solo play? It seems like it could be quite difficult to clear and then still be able to get, defeat Crossbones before time runs out.
It's only but it's got like effectively it's a advanced type thing on it. The fact of the matter is the deck is like 40 cards when you play Crossbones, and there's only 13 of his cards in the deck, and there's only one of this. Chances are you just don't see it. You don't see many of his cards in a general playthrough at all. I actually did not realize this was in his set because it in my however many games I've played against Crossbones so far, I haven't had it flip up. At least not at any point that it could be impactful. Maybe like if it flips up on final turn or something, like it doesn't matter. If it flips up when you're already racing, it doesn't matter. There's a lot of cases where this just doesn't matter, and yes, it could flip up turn 1, and that's pretty bad. But it's just so unlikely.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with you in that. And also, I think because his health is low enough, you could race him potentially still. It just requires a different approach.
30 HP for expert mode on solo is not a lot and he's got no mechanics to slow you down besides his armor.
Yeah. I guess the one other card I wanted to talk about with his sort of scenario was Legions of Hydra, and sort of how much more impactful that card is when it enters play with 7 threat rather than 5. The reason being is that Crossbones himself has the Hydra trait, and so it becomes a very challenging card in solo play, I found, to both remove 7th threat and deal with Man and Hydra and deal with Crossbones. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on your experience with it and how best to approach that.
I have. Okay, so Legions of Hydra is a problem card in solo in general. If it hits the table, it's really bad for you. There's not a lot of ways to deal with it, and currently, my experience with it in Crossbones is if it hits the table, you are in a race. You have at most your current HP divided by 2 turns left in the game, and you've turned on heroic mode 1. So good luck for and that's just how Legions of Hydra has worked in my experience in solo. Against Crossbones, 7 is just too much to clear. I suppose maybe you could do it if you're Captain America could probably do it with like Hero Determination if you happen to have it in hand the turn it comes out. Because once it gets to 9, because you didn't deal with it, it's too big. Iron Man could probably do it with a Heroic Intuition, but those are like the highest fraught characters that we have in solo play. I would not suggest focusing only on that. You're probably better off just leaving it and just seeing how fast you can rush him down, which generally speaking is very fast.
Yeah, it's a similar thing in multiplayer. Like if you think about 4-player, right? Imagine if one player draws Hail Hydra, no one's got Hydra minions in front of them, so everyone goes and digs for a Hydra minion, and then the next player's encounter card is Legions of Hydra. Just the impact that has. I mean, that's an effective additional 12 threat placed on Legions of Hydra. So at that point, you're playing with the additional hazard, and I guess the trade-off there is that there's 4 of you, so it's 1 card between 4 rather than the solo experience you're saying of the pressure to win is the Joey formula of half your health turns left to close out the game. I like that one.
Yeah, you could theoretically, if you're not on the final scheme, flip to Alter Ego for a turn to buy your, but you really need, if you're going to do that, to recover on both sides of the turn, because you're going to need all the hit points you can get, because you're not flipping back after that.
Yeah. I just thought it was a nice little addition to the overall experience that's recommended. And for me, that kind of put the bow on the scenario, and I think this is just a fantastic introduction scenario, and something that I, like yours saying, I'd want to replay over and over again. And I still come back to this scenario and I have a lot of fun. And so, yeah, I just thought, what was your concluding thoughts on the overall scenario?
Play the recommended modular sets most of the time. I've been randomizing. It doesn't really work a lot of the time. Just the not having any weapons. He doesn't have, like, you can't, if you put Doomsday Chair in here, he doesn't have any minions for it to trigger off of, so it just it does nothing. You can put in, say, goblin gimmicks as a replacement for one of these, but the recommendeds are very strong and have a very good thematic tie for him. I think it works a lot better with the recommendeds as opposed to just randomizing modular sets. Yeah.
And I guess the one thing I would say is, if I was going to customize it, I kind of like the idea of putting modular sets that have, like, as many pips as possible. So I think currently that's Doomsday Chair, Legions of Hydra.
Doomsday Chair, Legions of Hydra, followed by Goblin Gimmicks. Although I haven't run the numbers on the new ones, although I think they're kind of low from what I recall off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think they are slightly low. But I was just curious if the machine gun kills me more often than not if I went that route. But yeah, like I said, I think it's a fantastic scenario overall, and I personally find that there is a lot of replayability in what's been provided. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic one that I will come back to over at least the next 6 months, but probably into the far future. Great. So that's it for our impressions of Scenario 1, Crossbones of the Rise of Red Skull. Like I said, this is part 2 of our ongoing series. And so you'll be able to tune in next week when we start deep diving into Scenario 2, Absorbing Man. Joey, as always, thanks for being on the show.
Great to be here.